Montana Territory, autumn 1887. Samuel Garrett was a 42-year-old former copper miner from Butte who'd spent a decade tunneling through rock 1,000 feet below the surface. He couldn't shake what he'd learned underground. The temperature stabilizes with depth. That autumn, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood, Samuel started digging beneath his barn floor. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. Master builder Jonas Millwright stopped by one afternoon and watched Samuel haul buckets of dirt up a ladder. "You're wasting your time, Garrett," Jonas said. "Dirt don't keep you warm." Samuel didn't argue. He just kept digging. The problem wasn't the digging. It was the wind. Samuel had a wife, Catherine, and 2 children, Margaret, age 9, and Thomas, age 6. They'd been in the territory 3 years, homesteading a quarter section 2 miles south of the settlement. Their cabin was solid log construction with a stone chimney. But every winter, the wind found a way in. Catherine stuffed rags around the door. Samuel banked snow against the north wall. It didn't matter. The drafts came anyway, and the stove devoured cordwood faster than he could split it. 2 winters earlier, the Ketchum family, just 4 miles east, had frozen in their cabin during a blizzard. The father had gone out for wood and couldn't find his way back in the whiteout. By morning, the fire had died, and the mother and 3 children were gone. The settlement buried them in May, when the ground thawed. Samuel thought about that every time he looked at his own children. But he also thought about something else: the mine tunnels at Butte. 1,000 feet down, the temperature held steady year-round. Summer or winter, it stayed around 55 degrees. No stove, no fire, just the earth itself holding the temperature constant. The deeper you went, the less the surface weather mattered. Most men would have dismissed the idea. Samuel had the experience to trust it. By mid-October, Samuel had excavated a chamber 8 feet deep and 12 feet square beneath the barn floor. He lined the walls with fieldstone hauled from the creek bed, dry stacking them with clay mortar. He built a timber ceiling using 6-inch beams and planks, then covered it with 2 feet of dirt and straw for insulation. He cut a trapdoor in the barn floor and built a sturdy ladder. The chamber had a small door at ground level on the south side of the barn, hidden by the structure itself. Samuel framed it with timber and hung a thick plank door. Inside the chamber, he built a sleeping platform along one wall, wide enough for the whole family. He installed a small cast-iron stove in the corner, with a pipe that vented up through the barn and out the roof. Catherine watched him work and said very little. She trusted him, but she didn't understand. "It'll be warm," Samuel told her one evening. "The earth holds the temperature. We won't need much fire." "And if you're wrong?" she asked. "Then we'll go back to the cabin." Jonas Millwright wasn't the only one who thought Samuel had lost his mind. At the trading post, men joked about the mole hole. At church, women whispered that Catherine should talk sense into her husband. Even the children at school teased Margaret and Thomas about living underground like prairie dogs. Samuel let them talk. He'd heard worse in the mines. By early November, he'd moved the family's bedding and winter supplies into the chamber. He stocked it with flour, beans, salt pork, and preserved vegetables. He built shelves along the walls and hung lanterns from the ceiling beams. Catherine brought down quilts and wool blankets. The children carried their few toys and books. The cabin above remained standing, and they used it during the day for cooking and chores. But at night, they descended the ladder and closed the trapdoor behind them. The first week, it felt strange. The children whispered that it was too dark, too quiet. Catherine missed the windows. But Samuel noticed something else. Even without a fire, the chamber stayed noticeably warmer than the cabin had at night. The fieldstone walls radiated a gentle, steady warmth. The air was still, with no drafts. He lit the stove for an hour each evening, just enough to bring the temperature up to comfortable. Then he let it die, and the warmth held. The problem started the first week of December. The temperature dropped fast. By December 7th, it was 10 below zero at midday. By December 10th, it was 15 below at dawn and never climbed above zero. The wind came out of the north and didn't stop. It howled across the valley day and night, driving snow horizontally, piling drifts against every structure. Samuel's neighbors burned wood at a desperate rate. Families woke every 2 hours to feed their stoves. Men split cordwood by lantern light in the middle of the night. Women stuffed every crack with rags and old cloth. Children slept in coats and mittens. The Hargrove family, a mile west, ran out of wood on December 13th. They burned furniture. They burned part of their barn wall. By the 15th, they'd moved in with the Scanlon family, crowding 2 families into one cabin, doubling the burden on a single stove. At the trading post, the price of firewood tripled. Men fought over the last cords. Samuel's family stayed below. Every evening, Samuel descended the ladder and closed the trapdoor. He lit the stove with a handful of kindling and a few split logs. Within 30 minutes, the chamber warmed to a comfortable temperature. He let the fire die after an hour, and the heat stayed. The fieldstone walls absorbed the warmth and radiated it back slowly through the night. The children slept under wool blankets without coats. Catherine cooked simple meals on the stove before letting it go cold. The air stayed still and breathable. The walls never showed frost. Above ground, the wind screamed. Below, it was silent. By December 18th, the temperature outside had dropped to 21 below zero. The cold snap held for 2 straight weeks. Jonas Millwright came by on December 21st. He knocked on the barn door, and Samuel climbed up to meet him. Jonas looked exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands shaking from cold even inside thick gloves. "I've been burning wood non-stop for 13 days, Jonas said. "My wife can't sleep more than an hour before the cabin drops below freezing. How are you managing?" Samuel gestured toward the ladder. "Come down and see." Jonas hesitated, then followed him down. The warm air hit him the moment his head dropped below floor level. By the time he reached the bottom, he was staring. Catherine was mending by lantern light. The children were reading at the table. The stove was cold, and the chamber was warm. Jonas walked to the wall and put his hand on the fieldstone. It was warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat. He looked at the sleeping platform, the shelves, the closed door. No drafts, no wind sound, just still, warm air. "How warm is it down here?" Jonas asked. "About 68 degrees right now," Samuel said. "It never drops below 60, even when the stove's been out all night." "How much wood are you using?" "Maybe 1/10 of what I used in the cabin. I light the stove for an hour in the evening. That's it." Jonas didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "The earth's holding the heat." "The earth is the heat," Samuel said. 8 feet down, it stays around 55 degrees year-round. Doesn't matter what the air temperature is. I'm just adding 15 degrees with the stove, and the stone holds it. Jonas looked around again. No drafts. No wind. The air down here is completely still. That's half the battle. Up in the cabin, the wind was always stealing the heat faster than the stove could make it. Down here, there's nothing to steal it. You're sleeping down here? Every night, since November. Jonas climbed the ladder slowly. At the top, he turned back. I called you a fool. You weren't the only one. I was wrong. By Christmas, half the settlement knew about Samuel's underground chamber. Men stopped by to see it, descending the ladder one by one and emerging silent and thoughtful. Women asked Catherine how the children were sleeping. Families compared firewood consumption and realized Samuel was using a fraction of what they burned. The ridicule stopped. By New Year, 3 families had started their own excavations. By spring, 7 families had built similar chambers, some beneath barns, some dug into hillsides, all using the same principle: depth, stone, and still air. Jonas Millwright helped build 2 of them. He never charged for his labor. He said it was payment for what he'd learned. The physics were simple, once you understood them. At 8 feet below the surface, the ground temperature in Montana holds steady around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This is below the frost line, where seasonal temperature swings don't penetrate. The Earth itself acts as a massive heat sink, storing warmth from summer and releasing it slowly through winter. By building a chamber at that depth and lining it with fieldstone, Samuel created a structure that started every day at 55 degrees without any fuel. The stone walls absorbed heat from the small stove and radiated it back for hours after the fire died. The insulated ceiling and the surrounding earth prevented heat from escaping upward. Above ground, a cabin loses heat in 3 ways: conduction through the walls, convection from air movement, and infiltration from wind. Samuel's chamber eliminated 2 of those. The earth insulated against conduction, and the sealed structure eliminated wind infiltration entirely. A small amount of heat from the stove was enough to raise the temperature 15 degrees and hold it there. It wasn't magic. It was depth, mass, and stillness. The winter of 1888 tested everyone. January brought another cold snap, this one lasting 3 weeks, with temperatures dropping to 35 below zero. The settlement that winter had 11 families living in underground chambers. They used a combined total of wood that was less than 3 families had burned the previous winter. The families still in surface cabins struggled. 2 more families ran out of wood. One family's chimney caught fire and burned their cabin to the foundation. They moved into a neighbor's underground chamber and stayed until spring. By 1890, 14 families in the valley had built similar structures. Some expanded them into full living quarters with multiple rooms. Others used them only for winter sleeping. A few built them as root cellars with sleeping platforms added. The design variations were creative. Some families dug into hillsides and built stone facades with windows. Others went deeper, reaching 10 or 12 feet, where the earth temperature was even more stable. A few experimented with double-wall stone construction for additional thermal mass. Jonas Millwright became an advocate. He designed chambers for families who didn't have mining experience. He taught men how to shore up excavations safely, how to select stone for walls, how to calculate ceiling load. He never mocked anyone for asking questions. And he never mentioned his own earlier skepticism, unless someone brought it up first. In 1892, He built an underground chamber for his own family. He dug it 10 feet deep beneath his barn and lined the walls with fitted stone. He installed a larger stove and added a second room for storage. His wife said it was the warmest winter she'd ever experienced. "I've been building cabins for 30 years, Jonas told Samuel one spring afternoon. "I thought I knew everything about keeping people warm. You taught me I didn't know the most important thing." "What's that?" "That the earth is free fuel. You just have to go down and get it." Not everyone adopted the design. Some families preferred surface cabins for the windows and daylight. Others worried about cave-ins or poor ventilation. A few simply didn't want to live underground, regardless of the fuel savings. The settlement respected those choices. There was no single right answer. But the families who did build underground chambers consistently reported the same results. Warmth with minimal fuel, stable temperatures, protection from wind, and peaceful sleep through the worst storms. The children who grew up in those chambers remembered them decades later as the warmest winters of their childhood. By 1900, the settlement had grown into a small town. New families arrived with modern lumber and factory-made stoves. They built frame houses with proper foundations and coal furnaces. The underground chambers started to seem old-fashioned, a relic of harder times. Some families filled theirs in and built new houses on top. Others kept them as root cellars or storm shelters. A few continued living in them through winter, preferring the fuel savings and the quiet. Samuel's family used their chamber until 1903, when they built a new frame house on the property. They kept the chamber intact beneath the barn, using it for storage and as a cool place in summer. Samuel's children brought their own children down the ladder to see where they'd grown up. By 1920, most of the original chambers had been filled in or abandoned. The barns above them were torn down or collapsed. The fieldstone walls were buried under decades of accumulated soil and debris. Jonas Millwright died in 1908. His obituary in the county newspaper mentioned his decades of building homes and barns throughout the territory, but it didn't mention the underground chambers. That knowledge had already started to fade. By 1930, few people in the valley remembered the original design. The younger generation had grown up with coal furnaces and insulated frame houses. The idea of living 8 feet underground seemed strange and primitive, something their grandparents had done out of desperation. The settlement records from that era list 14 underground dwellings built between 1887 and 1895. But the records don't explain why they worked or what happened to them. The physics wasn't written down. The construction details weren't preserved. The knowledge survived only in the memories of the families who'd lived in them. And those memories faded as the generations passed. By 1950, almost all evidence of the chambers was gone. A few stone foundations remained visible where barns had been torn down, but most people didn't know what they were looking at. The entrances had been filled in, the trapdoors removed, the ladders rotted away. Samuel Garrett's original chamber was filled in sometime in the 1940s, when the barn was demolished. The new owners of the property didn't know it existed until the excavator's bucket broke through the timber ceiling and exposed the fieldstone walls below. They filled it with dirt and gravel and built a machine shed on top. The knowledge of how to build those chambers, how to calculate the depth, how to select and stack the stone, how to ventilate them safely, all of that disappeared within 2 generations. What remained was the fuel consumption data recorded in a few family journals and county records. Those numbers told a clear story. Families living in underground chambers used between 1/5 and 1/10 the firewood of families in surface cabins during the same winters. The physics hadn't changed. The earth still held steady at 55 degrees 8 feet down. The principle still worked. But the knowledge of how to use it had been forgotten. The children who'd grown up warm in those chambers became grandparents. Some of them told their grandchildren about the underground rooms, the fieldstone walls, the winter nights when the wind howled above and the air below stayed warm and still. But by then, those stories sounded like frontier tales from another world. The grandchildren lived in houses with central heating and insulated walls. They couldn't imagine why anyone would dig 8 feet into the ground and live by lantern light. The context was gone. The necessity was gone. And so the knowledge faded into the category of things that grandparents remembered but couldn't quite explain. What Samuel Garrett understood, and what the settlement learned through one brutal winter, was this: the earth is a battery. 8 feet down, it stores summer warmth and releases it through winter. You don't need to generate heat from scratch. You just need to tap into the heat that's already there and keep it from escaping. The surface cabins were fighting against the wind and the cold, with nothing but combustion and wood. The underground chambers started 15 degrees warmer than the outside air before any fire was lit. And they held that warmth because the earth insulated them on 5 sides, and the wind couldn't reach them at all. It worked because it was simple. Depth, stone, stillness, and a small fire. That combination kept families warm through winters that killed their neighbors. The modern science confirms what Samuel knew from experience. Geothermal stability at depth is a documented phenomenon. Below the frost line, ground temperature remains constant year-round, varying by only a few degrees. In Montana, that temperature is typically 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit at 8 feet. Thermal mass is equally well understood. Stone absorbs heat and releases it slowly over time. A 4,000-pound fieldstone wall heated by a small stove will radiate warmth for 12 to 16 hours after the fire goes out. Still air is a powerful insulator. Moving air strips heat through convection. Eliminate the movement, and you eliminate most of the heat loss. Samuel didn't know the technical terms. He knew the tunnels at boot stayed warm. And he knew stone held heat. That was enough. The cost was almost nothing. Samuel's total material expense was labor, which he provided himself, and the cost of the cast iron stove, which he would have needed anyway. The stone came from the creek. The timber came from his own woodlot. The door and ladder were built from scrap lumber. Compared to the cost of firewood over a single winter, the chamber paid for itself immediately. Compared to the cost of building a well-insulated surface cabin, it was a fraction of the expense. The time investment was about 3 weeks of steady work for one man. Samuel dug the chamber in October, lined it in early November, and moved his family in by mid-November. 3 weeks of labor bought 15 winters of warmth. The families who built chambers after Samuel reported similar results. The Whitmore family, who built theirs in 1889, recorded in their diary that they used 3 cords of wood the entire winter of 1890, compared to 18 cords the previous winter in their cabin. The Scanlon family reported indoor temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees through January 1891, with 1 hour of fire per evening. The Henderson family went deeper, excavating to 10 feet, and reported even greater stability. Their chamber never dropped below 62 degrees, even during the coldest nights. These weren't anecdotes. These were measurements recorded by practical people who tracked their fuel costs and their comfort carefully, because their survival depended on it. The tragedy is that the knowledge was lost, not because it stopped working, not because the physics changed, but because the necessity faded. As modern heating became available and affordable, the incentive to dig into the earth disappeared. And when the incentive disappeared, the knowledge went with it. By the time energy costs rose again in later decades, the people who remembered how to build those chambers were gone. The structures themselves were buried or destroyed. The records were scattered across county archives and forgotten family journals. What remained was the principle. Depth stabilizes temperature. Mass stores heat. Stillness prevents loss. Those facts haven't changed. The Earth is still a battery. The physics still work. Samuel Garrett died in 1924 at age 79. His obituary mentioned his work in the copper mines and his homestead, but it didn't mention the chamber. By then, it had been filled in for years, and the story had faded. Catherine lived until 1931. She told her grandchildren about the winters underground, but they didn't understand why anyone would choose to live that way. To them, it sounded like hardship. To her, it had been warmth and safety, when both were scarce. Jonas Millwright's grandchildren sold his property in 1935. The new owners tore down the barn and filled in the chamber without knowing what it was. The fieldstone was hauled away and used to build a retaining wall on another property. The innovation worked because the problem was clearly defined and the solution was appropriately scaled. Samuel wasn't trying to heat a mansion. He was trying to keep 4 people warm through a Montana winter with minimal fuel. The chamber did exactly that. Modern applications of the same principle exist. Earth-sheltered homes, passive geothermal design, underground construction for thermal stability. The knowledge has been rediscovered and formalized, but it's rarely applied at the simple, accessible scale that Samuel used. Before building any structure, especially one involving underground construction, consult with professional engineers, follow local building codes, ensure proper ventilation and drainage, and obtain all necessary permits. Modern safety standards exist for good reasons, but the principle remains sound. The Earth still holds steady at depth. Stone still stores heat. Still air still insulates. And a small fire, properly placed, can keep a space warm when the world above is frozen solid. Samuel's chamber kept his family alive through winters that tested everyone. It wasn't the only solution, and it wasn't perfect for every family. But it was his solution, built with his own hands using knowledge he'd earned 1,000 feet underground, and it worked when it mattered most. The ridicule stopped the night Jonas Millwright climbed down that ladder and felt warm air in the middle of winter. The skepticism ended when the numbers were compared, and the fuel consumption proved the physics. And the knowledge spread because people could see it, measure it, and build it themselves. That's how practical innovation works. You solve the problem in front of you with the resources you have and the knowledge you've earned. You let the results speak, and if you're fortunate, others learn from what you've built and improve on it. Samuel never claimed to have invented anything. He said he'd just applied what he already knew to a new problem. The mines taught him about depth and temperature. The winters taught him about wind and fuel. The chamber was simply the intersection of those 2 lessons. Cinematic historical documentary photography. Same valley from original images. Spring 1888. Snow melting. Multiple families emerging from their underground chambers after a successful winter. Children playing in the mud. Adults inspecting their structures. The community transformed by the shared knowledge, hope and relief visible in the scene. Documentary realism, natural daylight, film grain texture, fictional settlers, faces not identifiable, wide shot. No resemblance to any real person or public figure. It worked because it was simple. The families who succeeded with the chambers were the ones who understood that simplicity. They didn't try to improve the design with complexity. They dug to the right depth, built solid walls, insulated the ceiling, and trusted the earth to do its work. The few failures came from overthinking. One family in 1889 tried to build a chamber only 4 feet deep, thinking it would be easier. They spent the winter cold because they hadn't reached the stable temperature zone. Another family built elaborate ventilation systems that created drafts and pulled the warmth out. A third family tried to heat a chamber twice the size Samuel had built and couldn't keep up with the volume. The successful chambers all followed the same basic pattern: 8 to 10 feet deep, 12 to 16 feet square, heavy stone walls, insulated ceiling, small stove, single entrance with a solid door. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Just the minimum requirements to tap into the earth's steady temperature and hold the heat from a small fire. Samuel never charged anyone for advice. When men came to ask how deep to dig or how thick to build the walls, he walked them through it step by step. He helped them calculate the size based on their family. He showed them how to test the stone for cracks and how to stack it for stability. He taught them what he knew, because he'd learned it from miners who taught him. And that's how knowledge worked on the frontier. You shared what kept you alive. Jonas Millwright took the same approach. After he built his own chamber and proved it to himself, he helped others build theirs. He never mentioned his earlier criticism unless someone brought it up. And then, he was honest about it. "I was wrong," he'd say. "I didn't understand the physics. Once I saw the temperature measurements and felt the difference myself, I couldn't deny it anymore." That's what evidence does. It changes your mind if you let it. By 1895, the settlement had developed a collective understanding of underground construction that went beyond what any single family knew. They'd learned through trial and error which depths worked best, which stone types held heat longest, how to prevent moisture problems, how to design ventilation that didn't create drafts, and how to size the chambers for different family needs. That knowledge base represented dozens of family years of experience, hundreds of cold nights, thousands of observations and adjustments. It was practical knowledge, earned the hard way, and it worked reliably. And then it vanished within a generation. The fundamental problem was that the necessity disappeared before the knowledge could be formalized. By the early 1900s, coal was widely available and affordable. Frame lumber came by rail. Modern stoves were more efficient. The incentive to dig 8 feet into the ground and live by lantern light simply wasn't there anymore for new families. The families who'd built the chambers kept using them because they knew how well they worked. But they didn't write instruction manuals. They didn't document the construction details. They didn't teach their children how to build new ones, because their children were growing up in a world where that skill wasn't needed. So the knowledge stayed in their heads, and when they died, it died with them. By 1920, if you'd wanted to build one of those chambers, You'd have had to find one of the original builders or their children and ask them directly. By 1940, even that was difficult. By 1960, it was essentially impossible. The last people who remembered the construction details were elderly and scattered, and nobody was asking them anymore. The chambers themselves lasted longer than the knowledge. Several remained intact and usable into the 1930s. A few families still used them as root cellars or storm shelters. But by the 1940s, most had been filled in or had collapsed. The timber ceilings rotted. The fieldstone walls shifted. The trapdoors were removed when barns were demolished. By 1950, physical evidence of the chambers was rare. Occasionally, someone would find a depression in the ground or a pile of fieldstone in an odd location and wonder what it had been. But without context, there was no way to know. The County Historical Society in the 1960s recorded a few oral histories from elderly residents who mentioned the underground dwellings. But the interviewers didn't understand the significance. They thought it was just a curiosity, a strange thing people did back when times were hard. They didn't recognize it as a sophisticated application of geothermal principles and thermal mass storage. The records exist in an archive somewhere, filed under frontier hardship stories, not under innovative building techniques. That's how knowledge is lost. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. As context fades and necessity changes, and the people who understood it pass away without anyone thinking to ask them the right questions. Samuel's great-grandson visited the property in 1978. He was researching family history and wanted to see where his great-grandfather had homesteaded. The current owners were friendly and showed him around. He asked about the underground chamber, and they had no idea what he was talking about. He showed them a reference in an old family letter that mentioned the warm room below the barn, and they said they'd never heard of any such thing. The barn was long gone. The ground showed no obvious signs. Whatever had been there was buried under decades of soil and vegetation. He asked if he could dig to see if the walls were still there, and they said no. They didn't want holes in their property looking for something that probably didn't exist. So he left without seeing it, and whatever remained of Samuel's original chamber stayed buried. The irony is that the physics never stopped working. The Earth still holds steady at 55 degrees, 8 feet, down in Montana. Stone still stores heat. Still air still insulates. The principle is as sound today as it was in 1887. Modern earth-sheltered building has rediscovered these principles and applied them with contemporary materials and engineering. But it's treated as cutting-edge sustainable design, not as the rediscovery of knowledge that frontier families used routinely 100 years ago. The technology has been reinvented, but at a much higher cost and complexity than Samuel's simple fieldstone chamber. Modern earth-sheltered homes involve engineered foundations, waterproofing systems, mechanical ventilation, and professional design. They work beautifully, but they're expensive and require expertise most people don't have. Samuel's chamber could be built by one person with hand tools in 3 weeks for almost no money. That accessibility has been lost in the modern reinvention. Which isn't to say modern approaches are wrong. Building codes exist for safety. Professional engineering prevents collapses. Proper waterproofing prevents mold and structural damage. These are real improvements over frontier construction. But something valuable was lost when the knowledge transitioned from practical folk wisdom that any homesteader could apply to specialized technical knowledge that requires professional implementation. The question is whether that trade-off was necessary or whether some middle path could have preserved the accessibility while incorporating modern safety understanding. We'll never know, because the knowledge gap is too wide. The people who could have bridged it are gone. What remains is the historical record, incomplete and scattered. A few journal entries, a handful of county records, some oral histories that mention underground rooms but don't explain how they worked. And the physics itself, unchanged and still valid, waiting to be understood again. Samuel Garrett never wrote down his process. He showed people in person, walking them through the construction, answering their questions as they worked. That was the frontier method of teaching. Hands-on, practical, transferred from person to person. It worked for transferring knowledge within a community. It failed completely at preserving knowledge across generations. If Samuel had written a detailed construction manual, if Jonas Millwright had published measurements and techniques, if the county had documented the chambers as innovative architecture rather than poverty housing, the knowledge might have survived. But they didn't, because that wasn't how things were done. You built what you needed. You helped your neighbors build theirs. And you assumed your children would learn if they needed to. And that assumption failed when the need disappeared before the knowledge could be captured. The end.